I'm pleased to be here this morning with you all.
我今日好高興能夠同大家一齊。
I'm a missionary with the International Mission Board.
我係南浸信會嘅海外嘅宣教士，
And so I'm very familiar with Jesus' commission for us to go into the world and preach the gospel.
所以我對於主耶穌喺馬太福音最後話講到話，我哋要去普天下傳福音呢個大使命咧，我係好熟悉嘅。
And it's good to see that this church is very involved in sending people into the world to share the good news of Jesus Christ.
咁我亦都好高興能夠見到呢個教會咧，係能夠差派弟兄姊妹咧去到普天下去傳福音。
And I want to encourage you this morning to do this even more.
但係我今日想鼓勵大家嘅話咧，要加油。
This morning I'm preaching from the book of Haggai.
今日早晨我哋講嘅經文係出於哈該書。
And only a few verses were read from the book of Haggai.
我哋淨係喺其中取咗幾節出嚟讀而已啫。
I didn't feel like we could read the whole book together.
因為我相信我哋唔能夠用時間將全本書讀晒。
But I'm going to attempt to share the basic message of the book of Haggai with you this morning.
但係我咧就今日咧就盡量咧能夠將呢個哈該書入邊最簡單嘅最重要嘅主題咧同大家分享。
I believe that this is a message that's very relevant for our mission endeavors.
所以呢個我覺得係咧為咗我哋去做傳福音嘅工作入邊咧係個好重要點。
Because the people that Haggai spoke to were people that really were on a mission as well.
因為當哈該同嗰班猶太人講說話嗰陣時咧，嗰啲猶太人亦都係喺同樣嘅情形之下。
In fact, Haggai delivers the Lord's message that they are to build his house.
咁哈該對猶太人佢哋講嘅說話係咩咧？就係建立神嘅殿。
But as they sought to build God's house, there were significant obstacles that they encountered.
但係當佢哋開始建呢個神嘅殿嗰陣時咧，佢哋碰到好多嘅難題。
And I believe that these are the same obstacles that we also encounter.
我哋相信我哋而家做傳福音嘅事工上面碰到嘅難題咧係同類嘅。
The people of Israel were distracted by their own self-interest.
因為好多時候咧，嗰啲猶太人啊，因為佢哋自己有自己嘅私心，同埋另一方面咧做啲嘢嚟嗰陣時咧，散咗心，唔係集中精神喺度建聖殿。
And sometimes we are distracted from doing God's work because we're more focused on ourselves than on God.
咁我哋都係咁樣嘅人嚟嘅吓，我哋好多時候做事咧，就係諗住我今日我自己做啲乜嘢嘢，而唔係諗到咧神嘅主題係乜嘢。
The people of Israel were also discouraged because they didn't see that they were accomplishing much.
另外一方面，以色列人咧當時咧，佢哋好喪心，因為點解咧？佢哋見到做咗嘥咁多功夫，但係做啲乜嘢咧？好似見到好少成就。
And sometimes we also become discouraged because we're a little bit disappointed in the results of our work.
咁我哋亦都係咁樣嘅會頹喪，點解咧？因為我哋好多時候失望。
And the people of Israel were also easily tempted and led astray.
咁以色列人咧，仲有一個弊處咧，就係點樣咧？俾人好容易引誘做咗第二樣嘢。
And so this element of sin and defilement in their lives really was negating all the good work they were doing.
所以喺以色列人嘅當中，佢哋犯嘅罪同埋呢個所謂污染不聖潔嘅事情咧，亦都係好多方面咧，變咗好似取消咗佢哋所成就嘅工作。
And sometimes this happens to us as God's people as well.
咁我哋係神嘅子民，我哋時時都會碰到呢樣嘅問題。
And so the book of Haggai gives us a very comprehensive response to these obstacles that we often encounter as we're fulfilling the mission of God.
所以哈該書入邊就講到咧，一個好普泛嘅一個答案就話啦，當我哋要成就神嘅大使命嗰陣時咧，我哋碰到咩事情咧？點樣嚟解決？
And so I see that the first thing that the book of Haggai teaches us is that we should be diligent to build God's house rather than be distracted by our own self-interest.
所以呢度講到話咧，就係話，當我哋要去建立神嘅殿嗰陣時啊，唔好為咗我哋自己心中嘅私意咧，就俾人嚟做咗第二樣嘢。
This is the focus of the first chapter of the book of Haggai.
呢個係哈該書第一章嘅主題。
The people of Israel were certainly distracted by their own self-interest.
因為點解咧？我哋頭先讀過啦，就見到咧，佢哋嗰啲以色列人咧，佢有自己嘅心意，就結果將自己嘅心意咧，就擺咗喺神嘅心意之上。
They were saying it was not time to build the Lord's house.
咁佢哋時時用嘅藉口係咩咧？就話時辰未到。
But they themselves were living in their own luxurious houses.
但係佢哋自己嗰班人咧，就住喺好靚嘅、好繁華嘅屋入邊。
Rather than doing the work of the Lord, the text says that they were busy running to their own houses.
咁喺聖經度講到話咧，佢哋點樣啊？成日忙住啊，急腳咧，返自己屋企啊。
And it's so easy for us to get caught up in the materialism of our present age and be distracted by these material possessions from doing the work of the Lord.
所以我哋而家住喺呢個物質社會入邊咧，好容易一下咧，俾好多啲物質啊、享受啲咁嘅嘢咧，就將我哋嘅心咧就掹咗去。
But the word of the Lord came to Haggai, build my house.
但係神嘅話語嚟到哈該先知道話，神話點樣啊？你們要建我的殿。
And then the rest of chapter 1 enumerates several reasons why they should focus their attention, they should be diligent to do the work of the Lord rather than be distracted.
咁跟住喺第一章除餘下嗰啲經文咧，就講到話咧，就係話你哋要點樣，唔好散心，要集中精神嚟建呢個神嘅殿。
The first reason is that it's simply not right to focus on your own concerns while neglecting the work of the Lord.
咁第一個原因就係咩咧？就係話咧，你唔好將你自己嘅心中嘅盼望、思想成就先，而將神嘅聖殿建立聖殿咧放其次。
The Lord asks the question through Haggai.
咁所以咧，神就問嗰啲以色列民眾啦，咁就佢從俾呢個哈該叫佢哋問呢個問題。
Is it right for you to be living in your paneled houses while the house of the Lord is in ruins?
佢話咧，呢個這殿啊，即係神嘅殿咧，仲係荒涼，即係仲未起啊吓。但係你們咧就自己住喺有天花板的房屋吓，有天花板嘅房屋，即係話咧，佢唔係油嘅啲牆度啊，牆度咧係有板嘅 ，OK， 係靚屋嚟嘅。
And the implication is it's not right, it's wrong.
咁佢意思係咩咧？就係話咧，問呢個牛問題，即係話咧係錯嘅。
One of the primary arguments that Haggai uses is that actually failure to do God's work leads to dissatisfaction.
咁其中佢有另外一個更深嘅意思就係話啦，當你唔能夠達到神嘅旨意或者成就神嘅旨意嗰陣時咧，你個人咧會變成失望嘅人。
Ironically, the more we neglect the Lord's work and focus on our own self-interest, the more we experience dissatisfaction in the life that we live.
所以好奇怪嘅事情發生啦，就係話咧，如果你越係注重你自己嘅需要嗰陣時，而唔做神嘅旨意嗰陣時咧，你個人會越嚟越失望，越嚟越頹喪。
As the text reveals in verses 3 through 7, they were focusing on themselves, but everywhere they turned, they experienced disappointment.
因為其實第3、第4節嗰度係講到話呢個神要佢做嘅嘢咧，但係其他啲經文講咩咧？就係話啦，佢哋不論轉向到乜嘢事情去做嗰陣時咧，都完全失望。
They worked hard to put money in their wallets, but found out that there was a hole in their wallet.
咁咧佢哋講到話啦，賺好多錢，嗰啲錢咧等落個銀包度，銀包有個窿嘅喎，流晒出去。
And the reason is explained in verses 9 through 11.
但係第9到11節就咁解釋啦。
It is because they are hurrying to work on their own houses while neglecting the work of the Lord.
咁點解咧？就係話啦，因為佢哋個個都急腳要為自己起屋，而忘記咗神嘅聖殿。
And so the Lord was frustrating all of their plans, their self-centered plans.
所以神就特登點樣咧？使到佢哋將佢哋個人嘅期望咧，全部破壞。
And so they never could experience any satisfaction.
咁如果神喺一個人眾身上做啲咁嘅事情嗰陣時咧，你嘅心入邊有冇滿足咧？冇。
Another reason that we should focus on God rather than our own self-interest is because this is what's going to please and honor God.
咁第二個原因就係話啦，點解我哋要集中我哋精神係成就神嘅旨意咧？因為只有係成就神嘅旨意咧， 先會得到神嘅喜悅。
The command to build God's house is found in verse 8.
第8節就講到話啦，神俾個誡命佢哋，要佢哋起呢個聖殿。
Then Haggai indicates that it's by building the house of the Lord that they are going to please and honor God.
佢話啦，如果你係咁樣做嘅話咧，你就會得到喜樂，同埋得到神嘅喜悅。
This should be our primary ambition in life.
所以我哋做基督徒嘅話咧，我哋人生最基本嘅旨意係咩咧？就要成就神嘅旨意。
Paul says that his hopeful, eager expectation is that in everything he will please and honor God, whether he lives or dies.
所以喺保羅嘅書信入邊講到話咧，佢無論佢喺咩事情上面啊，要讓啲事情都要尊主為大，要成就一切神要做嘅事情，而使到神咧得到佢嘅喜悅。
Very often in society today, we are ambitious, but we are ambitious for the wrong things.
我哋喺社會入邊咧時時有野心，係嘛？但係咧嗰啲野心係注目喺咩度咧？係錯嘅事情。
We are ambitious to please and honor ourselves.
我哋好多時候就係話咧要我哋挺個自己咧能夠得到尊貴榮耀。
But instead, we should desire to please and honor God.
但係應該咧係點樣啊？應該我哋要使到我哋嘅神啊得到尊貴榮耀。
Well, after Haggai spoke his message, the people actually listened and obeyed.
嗱，其實啊，哈該講完之後咧，以色列人聽話喎。
They began to work on the temple of God.
咁佢哋開始啦，翻去起聖殿啦。
And it is explained in verse 12 why they chose to do so.
咁12節咧就講俾你聽，點解佢哋會咁樣嘅選擇咧？
They recognized that Haggai was speaking the words of the Lord.
原來第一，佢哋知道哈該所講嘅話咧，係神要佢講嘅話。
And it says that they obeyed because they feared God.
咁大家聽話嘅原因點解咧？因為大家係敬畏神，驚。
And so we should also be doing God's work because that is what God has commanded us to do, and we fear Him.
所以我哋要成就神嘅旨意嘅話，點解？因為我哋要敬畏神。或者講嚟咧，我哋對神你又驚驚地嘅嚇。
It's healthy to fear God.
係啊，我哋唔好成日以為恩典啊，我哋要驚下。
So there's sort of a mixed message in the Bible. We need to fear God, but not so much,
Grace.
Grace, yeah.
所以咧，好多時候啊，我哋睇聖經嗰陣時咧，我哋見到有兩樣事情發生，一個係恩典，係咪？但係另一方面係敬畏，敬畏其實佢係另物就驚，係嘛？呢兩樣嘢咧係合埋一齊嘅，甜酸苦辣啊，全部加埋一齊嘅話。
There's a verse in the Bible that really helps me understand this.
咁聖經入面有一節經文咧，幫助我哋明白。
And that's Exodus chapter 20, verse 20.
咁喺出埃及記20:20，出埃及記20:20。
That's where the people of God are standing before the Mount of God. They're receiving the revelation of God's commandments.
咁當時咧，以色列人咧就企喺嗰個塞乃山嗰度咧，就接受神嘅誡命啦。
But they are commanded, they need to approach the mountain.
咁咧，佢哋話咧，神同話俾你行近啲。
And so in verse 20, Moses speaks to them, says, don't be afraid to approach the mountain.
咁所以喺出埃及記20:20嗰度講咧，摩西對百姓說：不要懼怕。
But then he says, but God has revealed himself in this way so that you will fear him and do what he says.
佢話點解咧？因為神降臨啊，係要試驗你們，叫你們時常敬畏他，不致犯罪。
And so in the same verse it says, don't fear God, but fear God.
所以呢度講起嚟就係話咧，你要對神咧要驚，但係咧又唔好驚喎嚇。
So you shouldn't fear God so much that you're afraid to approach him.
所以咧你要驚神嘅話咧，你冇驚到話咧，我見神去離開山象嚇。
But you should fear God enough to obey him.
但係咧你要驚神嘅就係點解？你要聽神嘅話。
And as the chapter goes on, God supports them in their positive response to his word.
咁喺呢個哈該書第1章，在呢個11節以後咧，就講到話咧，神點樣嘅係繼續嘅係積極嘅嚟幫助佢哋成就佢哋起聖殿呢個事情。
And so in verses 13 through 15, God promises that he will be with them.
所以喺13到15節嗰度咧，神就俾佢哋應許就話咧，我與你們係 同在。
And he will rouse their spirits to do the work he's called them to.
咁另一方面咧，佢都將佢哋嘅心靈意志咧會提起嚟幫助成就。
And so here's another reason why we should be diligent to do God's work rather than distracted.
所以咧呢個另外又係一個原因，我哋點解要積極成就神嘅旨意，而唔係咧散咗心去做第二樣嘢。
Once we do, we are going to experience more fully the presence of God, and He is going to fill our lives with power to accomplish the task.
咁當我哋咁樣做嗰陣時咧，神嘅應許，神與你同在，呢個應許就成就喺你心中，咁咧你就更有能力咧去做多啲添。另外一方面，你心中得到滿足。
And so we should be diligent to build God's house.
所以我哋好勤力嘅去建立神嘅殿。
We should not be distracted by our own self-interest.
我哋唔好為咗因為有時候自己啲私心意咧而離開神。
Because it's wrong to neglect the work of the Lord.
因為我哋知道咧，我哋係忘記咗神嘅工作嗰陣時咧係錯誤嘅。
Failure to do the work of the Lord will only result in dissatisfaction.
而當我哋唔做神嘅旨意嗰陣時咧，我哋就係人生冇滿足。
You should do the work of the Lord because it is your ambition to please and honor God.
因為點解咧？因為要成就神嘅旨意咧，係應該係我哋每個人嘅心中嘅願望，我哋要得到神嘅喜悅。
You should be diligent to do the work of God rather than distracted because you fear God and He has spoken.
我哋要咁樣做，點解咧？另外一個原因就係話咧，因為我哋要敬畏神，我哋對神咧應該有啲懼怕。另一方面咧，神係講過呢個說話，咁佢講過嘅話，我哋就要做。
You should build up God's house because God is going to be with you and rouse up your spirit.
咁另一方面就係話啦，到咧就係話，當我哋建立神嘅聖殿嗰陣時咧，神俾我哋應許就話咧，耶和華咧就與我們會同在。另一方面，佢會幫助我哋嘅心靈意志。
The second teaching of this book is that we should be determined to build God's house rather than discouraged.
第二方面就係話咧，我哋唔好因為要建立神嘅殿嗰陣時咧，就變咗係頹喪咗或者失望。
This is the focus of chapter 2, verses 1 through 9.
咁呢個就係第二章第1到第9節嘅主題。
The people of Israel were disappointed and discouraged.
以色列人喺嗰個時候咧就開始失望。
At this point in the book of Haggai, they've already laid the foundation of the new temple.
嗱，我哋稍微要解釋一下，當時咧佢哋建呢個神嘅殿嗰陣時咧，佢哋開始咧將呢個地基已經建立咗啦。
And they've just begun to realize that this temple is not going to be anything like the old temple.
當佢哋將殿基搞掂咗之後，突然之間嗰班人成日諗起，哎呀，弊家伙，呢個聖殿啊，同以前個聖殿啊兩回事。
That temple was massive and majestic.
所羅門王建嗰個聖殿咧，靚到咧離奇。
This temple was going to be simple and austere.
但係呢間咧好似茅舍。
And I think they were a little bit disappointed and discouraged. What's the point of going on?
咁所以佢哋就諗住啦，哎呀，我哋起啲咁嘅簡單嘅聖殿啊，何必咧？
And so the Lord draws out their feelings of disappointment and discouragement through Haggai and 3 questions.
咁所以咧喺呢個時候咧，神咧又同哈該話咧，你問佢班人3個問題嚟幫助佢哋。
How many of you saw the old temple?
咁第一個問題係咩咧？就問啦，當時有以色列人嘅百姓啊，即係佢哋充軍翻完之後咧，有幾多個人啊見過以前嘅聖殿係點樣嘅？
Probably only a few of them would have seen the old temple.
咁可能咧幾個啫，係嘛？
How does this temple look to you?
咁話啦，你睇下呢個聖殿同以前嘅聖殿點樣啊？
And then the third question, doesn't it seem like nothing in comparison?
咁第3個問題就係話咧，呢個同嗰個比起，同舊嗰個比起嚟咧，根本就風牛不及馬。
And so this is really what they were feeling on the inside.
嗱，咁神問佢呢個3個問題咧，其實就係回答咗佢哋個人心中嗰個感受。
They were disappointed and discouraged because they were expecting something massive and majestic, but the work they were working on was really going to be very simple and austere.
因為當時佢哋起聖殿嗰陣時啊，仲有個印象話咧，呢個聖殿咧要好似好大好靚，但係佢哋而家見到佢哋手中所做出嚟嘅嘢咧，係好簡單嘅一個聖殿啫。
But God commands them through Haggai, be strong, be strong, be strong.
但係咧，神咧就不斷嘅用哈該同佢哋鼓勵佢哋話咧，你要強壯嘅做落去。
Work, do not be afraid.
你去做工唔好驚。
And then he starts to give them reasons why they should be determined rather than discouraged.
咁跟住神咧就俾佢哋原因話咧，你點解啊？你要決心嘅做落去，唔好啊失望。
And these reasons can also help us when we become disappointed and discouraged as we're doing the work of the Lord.
同樣嘅，當我哋喺呢度做神嘅事工嗰陣時咧，我哋時時咧會感覺到有啲失望或者頹喪，但係千祈唔好。而呢啲嘅話語咧，能夠一樣幫助我哋今日喺呢個方面咧有進步。
The first reason is that God will be with them as He promised.
第一個答案就係咩咧？話咧，神係與你同在嘅，因為佢應許過。
This is found in verses 4 and 5.
喺第4、第5節嘅應許。
And it probably refers back to the book of Exodus, chapter 34, 35.
咁咧，呢個可以睇佢哋回想到喺出埃及記34、35章入面講嘅說話。
At that time, they had sinned against God with the golden calf.
咁嗰陣時咧，猶太人咧拜咗金牛，咁咧就犯咗罪。
And this brought about a crisis in the covenant. God said, okay, you can still go into the promised land, but I'm not going to go with you.
喺嗰個時候，神就話啦，我應許之地你哋可以入去，但係咧，神話我唔會同你一齊去。
And Moses really protested and said, well, what's the point of us going into the promised land unless you go with us?
咁嗰陣時，摩西咧喺度抗議同神話啦，喂，我哋如果自己走去應許之地，你唔同我哋一齊去嘅話，何必咧？
And ultimately, God promised that He would be with them.
咁收尾神終於咧就好話啦 ，OK 好，我願意同你一齊入去啦。
Yeah, what is the point if God is not with us?
係嘛？如果神不與我哋同在嘅話，咁我哋信耶穌嘅人有咩好處啊？一啲都冇。
But this is a promise that we can always rely on even when we're experiencing disappointment and discouragement.
但係我哋知道，當我哋喺頹喪嗰陣時、失望嗰陣時如果我哋有呢個神嘅應許話咧，神係與我哋同在嘅話，呢個係一個非常大嘅鼓勵。
God has promised to be with us through all the difficult struggles we encounter.
神咧成日講過㗎，係嘛？我與你們常常同在，直到咩地極，係嘛？天后呢啲咁嘅應許好重要㗎。
And though others may be unfaithful to their promises, God will always be faithful to His promises.
雖然我哋做人時時咧答應咗唔算數，但係神嘅應許，神應許過嘅話咧，佢一定會繼續做落去嘅。
In verses 6 and 7, God says that He is going to intervene in the world and among the nations.
咁喺第6、第7節咧，第2章第6、第7節佢就話啦，我喺呢個世界入邊咧，我會嚟插手。
I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake the nations.
佢話咧，我會震天震地震海，我就會震動呢個萬民。
I think you all know what shaking is all about with the word earthquakes in California, right?
係嘛？呢個震我哋嗰個唔係深圳
I'm a Californian myself, so I'm familiar with our fears of earthquakes.
我哋係加州嚟嘅，所以我哋知道我哋呢個係地震呢個事情。
And earthquakes are great demonstrations of the power of God.
我哋可以睇到有地震嘅話，就係能夠表達到咩？神嘅大能。
And here he uses the image of the earthquake to stress that he is going to intervene with great power.
咁用呢個震咩意思咧？就係話咧，神會喺呢個世界入邊用佢嘅能力咧嚟改變事情。
And so when we encounter those difficulties, we become discouraged. We can always rely on God because He has the power to help us overcome every difficulty.
所以咧，我哋喺困難嘅時候，喺失望嘅時候，喺頹喪嘅時候，我哋唔使驚，因為點解？我哋嘅神有大能，佢嘅大能咧能夠幫助我哋咧克服我哋嘅問題。
In verses 7 and 8, He promises that He is going to supply whatever resources are required.
另外一方面咧，佢仲話 佢話咧，你起呢個聖殿啊，你需要乜嘢嘅材料，乜嘢嘅話咧，我會完全嘅供應。
He says the desired things of all people are going to come. And later he says, the silver and gold are mine.
咁咧佢就話啦，佢話咧喺世上嘅人啊，佢哋嘅心咧都會嚟呢個聖殿，但係最跟住又講話咧，金同埋銀咧都係我嘅。
And so God is going to supply whatever resources we require. We don't need to become discouraged so easily.
我哋當然我哋要成就神嘅旨意嗰陣時，咁咧神會有佢嘅資源嚟幫助我哋成就，我哋唔使擔心。
In verses 7 and 9, God promises that He is going to bring glory to His work.
另外一方面喺第7、第9節當中又話咧，神話咧，我會將我嘅榮耀啊彰顯出嚟。
In verse 7 he says, I will fill this house with glory.
第7節話咧，我會將呢個聖殿咧充滿咗我嘅榮耀。
And he even says in verse 9, the glory of this house is going to be greater than the glory of the former house.
喺第9節仲話點樣啊？仲話咧，佢話呢個聖殿嘅榮耀啊，會比所羅門王以前見過榮耀拆咗嗰個咧，仲更加榮耀添。
How is that possible?
問題出嚟啦，點能夠成就啊？
I believe it is possible because the glory comes from the presence of God, not from the size or magnificence of the buildings.
我相信神嘅榮耀咧，唔係淨係話咧，你間屋大、高、闊，另外一方面咧唔係，而係神嘅同在。
Yeah, remember that before they had the former temple, they had a tabernacle, which is basically a tent.
咁記唔記得啊？喺呢個所羅門聖殿之前咧，有個會幕，係咪？一個會幕咩？係一個棚帳嚟嘅，帳棚嚟嘅。
But it was a glorious tent because it was filled with the presence of the Lord.
咁記唔記得啦？嗰陣時咧，呢個會幕啊，係非常嘅榮耀。點解啊？因為神嘅同在嗰陣時，你可以見到啲煙出嚟啊。
And so we need to not be discouraged, but be determined because God is the one who's doing the work. God is the one who's going to make it glorious.
所以我哋唔使驚，亦都唔使擔心，因為點解咧？榮耀不在乎於我哋嘅身上，而係在乎於神所做嘅事情上邊。
Another promise in verse 9, we don't need to be discouraged, but can be determined because God will grant peace to those who do His work.
喺第9節，另外有一個應許係咩咧？就係話咧，我哋嘅神咧會將呢個平安賜到俾呢啲以色列人。
Underline all of these verses is a repeated name that is used for God.
咁喺呢啲經文上面咧，有一個字咧，就係從講嚟講去就講係呢個神。
Repeated 6 times in these verses is the Lord God Almighty.
咁咧呢個係咩咧？就係萬軍之耶和華呢個字就出現咗6次，每一次嘅應許嗰陣時嚟咧，就有呢個萬軍之耶和華講嘅說話。
God is the Lord Almighty. He is the one who will accomplish the work. We don't need to be discouraged because of our own feeble efforts, because God is going to do it.
咁所以咧，我哋啊，雖然人好軟弱係咪？但係我哋唔使驚，因為成就事情嘅咧係萬軍之耶和華。
So we should be determined to build God's house rather than discouraged.
所以咧，我哋要繼續嘅努力去建立呢個神嘅殿，而唔好傷心，而唔好失望。
Because God will be with us.
因為點解咧？有神嘅同在。
God will intervene with power among the nations.
神咧會喺萬族當中用佢嘅大能咧插手。
God will supply whatever resources are required.
一切我哋需要嘅資源，神會供應。
God will bring glory to His own work.
神會將佢自己嘅榮耀彰顯喺佢嘅聖殿上面，將佢自己嘅工作上面彰顯出嚟。
God will grant peace to those who do His work.
更有重要嘅就係話咧，凡行神嘅旨意嘅人咧，神會俾佢有平安。
And God is the Lord Almighty.
而我哋嘅神咧就係萬軍之神。
One last lesson.
最後一個功課
We should be devoted to God and avoid defilement.
我哋咧要專心向神，而唔好咧污染自己。
Evidently, the people of Israel had defiled themselves in some way.
嗱，我哋喺呢個哈該書嗰度睇見喺呢個第12章12節嘅後邊咧， 見到就發現咧，佢哋可能嗰啲以色列人啊做啲嘢咧係污染咗自己，將自己成為不聖潔。
Some sin had come into their lives and drawn them away from their commitment to God.
係有啲罪入咗嚟，引誘咗佢哋，將佢哋離開咗神嘅旨意度。
And this is a danger that we need to be alert for as well.
咁我哋今日嘅基督徒咧，對呢個危機要好注意同埋好小心。
Sin can destroy whatever work God is doing in our lives.
因為點解咧？罪能夠使到我哋咧喺我哋個人身上嘅成就會俾佢滅咗嘅。
We should avoid the presumption that just because we come to church, that makes us holy.
嗱，我哋唔好以為因為禮拜日我哋去教會嘅話，咁我哋就係聖潔嘅人。
Just because we're doing the work of the Lord, still, that doesn't guarantee that we are holy.
我哋雖然喺做緊神嘅事工嗰陣時，都唔能夠擔保話咧，我哋係聖潔嘅。
This is brought out in a couple of questions.
咁所以呢度咧又用問答嘅方法咧講出嚟啦。
In verses 11 and 12, basically the question is, does contact with something holy make something common holy?
呢度嘅問題就係咁樣，就係話咧，如果一個聖潔嘅嘢碰到一個唔聖潔嘅嘢，能唔能夠變成再聖潔咧？
And the priests answer correctly, no, it does not.
咁個祭司佢嘅回答就話啦，唔得嘅。
And then another question is asked.
咁第二個問題啦。
It is basically, does contact with something that is defiled make something that is common defiled?
咁咧，如果你係一個係普通嘅嘢，碰到一個污染嘅嘢，會唔會將呢個普通嘅嘢變成有污染嘅咧？
And again, the priests answer correctly, yes, this time.
咁呢個祭司回答就話會嘅。
So holiness is not contagious.
所以即係話咧，呢個聖潔呢種生活咧，唔係傳染病嚟嘅，傳唔出去嘅。
But defilement is extremely contagious.
但係咧，污染罪咧係非常大嘅傳染病。
And so we need to relate this to the situation of Israel and to us as well.
所以咧，我哋要喺呢方面咧，對以色列人嗰啲發生嘅事情，對我哋個人生活上咧，我哋要明白。
And Haggai says, so it is with you people.
點解咧？因為哈該跟住話咧，你班人咧又係咁樣嘅。
Just because they attended worship and were even doing the work of the Lord, that did not necessarily make them holy. They shouldn't presume on that.
即係話咧，雖然你喺度做緊神嘅旨意，你又去禮拜日去教會，但係咧你唔一定係聖潔嘅人。
But if they become defiled,
但係如果你係不聖潔咗啦，或者污染咗啦，
that really negates everything.
咁一切以前嗰啲成就好似冇晒咯。
In verse 14 it says that it defiles the works of their hands and everything they bring to worship God.
咁即係話咧，佢哋手中所行嘅各樣嘅工作帶去神嘅面前嗰度咧，全部都搞到烏哩單獨。
And so we need to be very careful to avoid sin that defiles.
所以我哋要非常嘅小心，特別係對呢個罪嘅問題。
We should avoid the presumption that because we come to church and do God's work, we're safe.
我哋唔好以為，因為我哋去教會又做神嘅工作嗰陣時咧，我哋就好安全。
I'm sure we've heard enough stories of Christian ministers and even missionaries that have been drawn away into sin and their ministries have been totally wiped out.
我哋相信大家都聽過係嘛？喺有啲好出名嘅牧師係嘛，或者有啲宣教士，因為咧犯咗罪之後咧，結果佢教會同埋以前所做嘅一切嘅事情，全部都冇晒。
I see I'm out of time and I'm aware of that.
夠鐘啦吓。
So basically the reasons that Haggai gives is that defilement results in God's judgment.
所以即係話啦，如果你係污染咗自己，即係犯咗罪嘅話咧，神就會審判。
Purity results in God's blessing.
如果你係聖潔嘅話咧，神就會祝福你。
We need to be like my son-in-law, who's a doctor.
我嘅女婿咧係個醫生。
He doesn't presume that because he is a doctor, he's immune from disease.
因為佢就話啦，我係做醫生，但唔係話咧我就唔會生病嘅吓。
That would be foolish because he's in contact with disease all the time.
因為點解咧？好多人咁樣諗啊，一個醫生成日見病人噶嘛，係咪？佢冇理由話做醫生嘅唔會生病㗎。
Instead, he takes careful precautions to avoid contamination.
但係佢咧就點樣咧？佢係好小心嘅，防止碰到傳染到病人嗰啲病。
We need to take extreme precautions to avoid defilement.
所以我哋做基督徒嘅一樣啊，要小心，唔好咧一下咧就碰到罪咧，就俾罪咧污染咗我哋。
We should be devoted to God and avoid defilement.
所以我哋咧係要專心嘅對神嚟防止自己咧係被呢個罪嚟污染我哋。
Because holiness is not contagious.
因為點解咧？聖潔呢回事啊，傳染唔出去嘅。
Defilement is extremely contagious.
但係犯罪咧就好容易傳嘅啫。
If you allow yourself to become defiled, your work and your worship for the Lord is also defiled.
因為如果你係污染咗嘅話，咁你對神嘅事工一樣，神嘅事工亦都被污染。
Defilement results in God's judgment.
咁如果係有污染嘅話，就會得到神嘅審判。
But devotion results in God's blessing.
但係我哋係忠心於神嘅話咧，我哋得到神嘅喜悅。
And so we are called also to build God's house.
咁我哋神都叫我哋話，我哋要建神嘅殿。
We are called upon to take the gospel to the world.
神係呼召咗我哋將呢個福音傳遍世界。
We need to avoid these dangers.
所以我哋咧要小心呢啲咁嘅事情。
We need to be devoted rather than distracted.
所以我哋咧要忠心而唔好散心。
We need to be determined rather than discouraged.
我哋要決心而唔係咧係失望。
We need to be devoted rather than defiled.
我哋要係忠心於神，而唔被罪咧嚟污染我哋。
My prayers are with you as you seek to fulfill God's mission for this church.
所以當各位你哋係要成就神對於個大使命呢個事情上面嘅時候，我會一齊同你哋禱告。神祝福你哋。